good. Chair. Is there an extra?
You can take those.
Okay, thank you so
I don't
much.
know where to put them as well.
Right there's time, yeah.
Okay, we're going to cover a lot today, folks. As I mentioned 2 weeks ago, that we were going to get into heavier theology from here on in, but we've just been through a very intensive week. I know some of you were able to come to some things, others were not able. Does anyone have any burning questions about what we've done so far, what we did today? Anything?
Is it a specific calendar event that warranted marching around the church with the icons, or?
Yes. So the Triumph of Orthodoxy, this is the Sunday of Triumph of Orthodoxy, happened to occur on the first Sunday of Great Lent when it occurred. It was a dogmatic issue that had no direct association with Great Lent per se. It just happened to occur in Great Lent that the declaration of the proper veneration of icons occurred. And so forevermore, rather than keep it on the actual date that it fell, it always just falls now permanently on the first Sunday of Great Lent.
Excellent.
So, but as you can see, the passages that we read in the Divine Liturgy did have a relationship to the iconography and what it meant to behold God in Christ, which is the chief. For us, icons are chiefly a Christological issue. Is Jesus really God who can be seen? And if he's not, then you can't make an icon. If he is, you must. That's the issue. It's a incarnation question. But yeah, that's why we do that on the first Sunday of Great Lent. Annunciation, of course, is this week. That's March 25th, which is 9 months before December 25th, the birth of Christ. So that's why that is a great feast that always falls, usually, I think always within Great Lent. I think there are some rubrics that suggest that it could fall during Holy Week, or, there are certain, on the edges, but usually it's deep enough that we've already started Great Lent. Any other questions, or we just want to go dive right into some theology here? All right, let's go. Today we're going to talk about 3 things, really. 2 things leading into a third. And I want to mention the third first so that we understand where we're going. What does it mean to be saved? And how does Christ save us? That is the fundamental question of Christianity. What is the salvation and the life that Jesus Christ comes to bring us? Why is that something that we wish to bring to ourselves? And if we ask that question, we then have to ask another question: what's wrong with me that I need saved in the first place? And exactly how is it that Jesus interacts with what's wrong with me? Those are all questions about the fall, of course, fall and redemption. But before we can even get to understanding the fall, we have to understand what and who a human person is. Because most of the time, we have a view of humanity that's been shaped by forces that are not Christian, or are Christian in a way that is gravely distorted from our Orthodox Eastern patristic viewpoint. And so I'm going to be speaking to that specifically, some of those things that are really, really distinct about our Orthodox anthropology, our Orthodox understanding of what it means to be human, really addresses the questions that get arised with what happened in the fall. Did it have to happen? Was it part of God's plan from the beginning? Et cetera, et cetera. What is the role of grace in nature, which we mentioned 2 weeks ago? So to that end, those are the things we're going to be talking about. And I'm just going to start reading some things and then raising theological issues as they come out. Christianity is the story of life overcoming death in and by Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. If religion is a human-centered attempt to make sense of the world around you, and thus many have attempted in modern times to dispense with those aspects of Christianity describing the physical world in favor of the scientific worldview. But if religion is a human-centered attempt to make sense of the world, then Christianity differs inasmuch as it claims to be not only revelation from God himself, but in fact the very actions of God in Christ, to which there were reliable witnesses. And the chief action was restoring or fixing what was wrong in humanity. Christ came to change something in us. What was it, therefore, that needed fixing? What was wrong with us and with the world? This is why the fall is so central to understanding Christian thought. If there was no fall, then Christ didn't come to fix anything, and he can be safely reduced to a wisdom teacher, maybe worth considering for wisdom, or at best someone who revealed the God, goddess within, Gnostic type things that can be tapped into by anybody seeking to reach their potential. And indeed, you find in a lot of mainstream Christianity, and especially mega-church Christianity, there's a lot about reaching your potential in the language that they use, fulfilling your potential. And maybe there's just a Christ in all of us, and we just have to let him out, right? That's not our position. But if there was a fall, and it's not our position because there was a fall, then it matters very much how we understand it, so that we can understand what Christ will do regarding the problem of death. Let us make man in our image. The human person has a very special place in the creation of the world. And that's very clear in Genesis. And we began talking about this 2 weeks ago, that Genesis is a work of prophecy. It is not a work of historical documentation. It is a work of prophecy in which Moses, the God-seer and prophet, is given a vision of the truth of the nature of the world. And then the truth of the nature of the world, within this good creation, the human person is created specially. God creates them directly. He breathes life into them, although they are created from the same dust as the rest of creation, and he places them in a garden of paradise. They are created in the image and after the likeness of God. And that means that the human person is intended to reflect who God is and how God is in our very structure and our very being. And there's a couple of things we need to say so that we can understand what it means to be human and how this functions. Let me just emphasize paradise here for a moment. Paradise is something really important because in Genesis, it just, we kind of get this idea that they're living in a garden and they have to leave the garden. I've mentioned many times in our classes on Wednesday nights the seminal work, Hymns on Paradise by St. Ephrem the Syrian, in which he describes the spiritual vision of paradise, where paradise is a mountain. There's an ascent to go to the center of paradise. In order to go to the center where the tree of life is, you've got to go up. And paradise occupies a special place. It is part of creation. It's part of the physical creation. And yet it is a spiritualized reality of creation as well. The human person can live in paradise in right relationship with God in a different way than we live in the flesh in the fallen world. That's really important for us to understand in terms of grasping the consequences of the fall. The most obvious thing is that in paradise, before the fall, there was no mortality. There was no death. The human person, according to the Holy Fathers, is, while by nature mortal, because only God is by nature immortal, we were created in His image and likeness, and therefore to be immortal by grace. As long as we are with God and in communion with God, we receive the energy of His grace, and we are gifted the life of immortality. And that is understood originally in paradise to be not about the soul, but about the body and the soul. And so here's a major point that we'll need to constantly keep in mind, that the human person in the Orthodox viewpoint is created as a body-soul unity. We are not a soul trapped in a body. That's Gnosticism. And the purpose of salvation in Christ is not for the soul to get out of the body and finally be free and go to paradise or heaven or whatever. That's also a form of Gnosticism, actually. That's probably the most popular understanding when we ask the question, how does Jesus save me? Usually we have in mind, when I die and my soul leaves my body, where does it go? That's the fundamental question. That is not the fundamental question for Orthodoxy. We were created to be a body-soul unity. That means that a full human person always has a soul and a body joined together. That also means that a body without a soul is not a full human person. It would be a corpse. But a soul without a body is also not a full human person. And that's really, really important. That means that, and we'll see this as we go later into theology here, into the Christological emphasis, that means that when the soul parts from the body in our individual death, that soul is not like the true you that has escaped and is now living in a different realm. That soul, in fact, will await its return to the body, and that is, as a matter of dogma, what we mean by the general resurrection. When Christ comes again, the dead will rise. That means that the souls of all the departed will reunite with their bodies. St. Gregory of Nyssa has one of the most striking images of what that means in terms of the recreation of the new earth. We'll get to that later in this thing with burning, but it just, for now, keep in mind that a soul without a body is not a full human person. We are meant to be physical creatures. God wants us to be physical creatures. Just as all of creation is good, so the body is good. Okay? And in fact, according to the Fathers, it was the fact that we had a body and that Christ would be taking that body to himself that led to the fall of the angels in their pride. Lucifer, who was one of the chief of all the angels, saw what Christ had in mind with the human person and thought, no, you're going to elevate them above us. And so he tries to pull us down. And that's part of the cosmology, really, of Orthodoxy, is that the fall of the angels is over the human body, which is why the demons attack the body so ruthlessly. But we have to also be careful not to attack the body. To think that Christianity is about escaping the body. It is not. So, we are a soul, body-soul unity, or you can say a psychosomatic unity. If you've ever heard of a psychosomatic illness, a spiritual illness that manifests itself spiritually, so it kind of twists our view of what psychosomatic means. But psychosomatic is simply Greek for soul-body. The soul and the body interact with each other. Suke means soul, and soma is body. There's a lot of interesting aspects of the human being in our body that in the Hebrew are very obvious, but in our English translations are not. And that is the oftentimes overlapping sense of spiritual things and body things together. So, for example, ruah is the Hebrew word ruha, is not spirit, as it's usually translated, but psychic movements physically expressed. The life force found everywhere, right? The movement of the Spirit of God is not simply a spiritual thing that cannot be seen, but a psychic movement physically expressed. Or the nephesh, the soul, is literally, in Hebrew, it refers to the throat and the neck, and by extension, the breath of the human person. And so in that ancient Semitic view of the human person, again, the Jews did not have originally this idea of there's a body and a soul leaves the body. Some have even suggested that that's a Babylonian influence or a Greek influence later on. It's not. It's in there, obviously. It's the spirit of man, the soul of man is very clearly in the scriptures. But it's just that in the Semitic mind, they really didn't have the conception of splitting the two. What's Greek in a later sense is this dualistic idea that the soul and the body are opposed to each other, that they're at war. Which reminds me of a question I wanted to ask you. How many of you heard there were new Dead Sea Scrolls found? Yeah. And this was 2,000 years ago. Segments of the Old Testament in a Jewish community in Palestine. And what language were they written in? Greek. They were written in Greek. We would think they were written in Aramaic, right? Just naturally we think, oh, that would be in the Hebrew, Aramaic. They're written in Greek. Why on earth, okay, 2,000 years ago, Hebrew documents, but they're written in Greek. Why would they be written in Greek?
Wasn't that the lingua franca?
Yeah, exactly. Because since the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 300s BC, that whole world, the common language of that whole Mediterranean basin was Greek. And I only mention that as sort of like a side note here. There's this idea in scholarship for the last couple of centuries that that for the first 300 years of Christianity, there was this pristine, perfectly Jewish, Semitic Christianity, and only later did the Greeks get a hold of it and start putting all kinds of Gnostic and Neoplatonic ideas into it, and they just ruined the whole thing, and now scholarship has to go back and try to find the original Christianity. Well, guess what? It was already in Greek. And in fact, the Greek language and Greek conceptual universe, Greek cosmology, was in dialogue with the Jewish worldview for centuries before Christ was even born. That's why the New Testament was written in Greek, right?
Was the Septuagint instead of the...
The Septuagint, right, which was the Greek Old Testament, which was translated in Alexandria, Egypt. Alexandria, Egypt, normally don't think of Egypt as a very Greek place. Alexandria was a Greek city in Egypt. Greek was the common language, and it was not the place of Pharaoh-type Egyptians that we think of when we think of Egyptians. So that world was much more dynamic and overlapping, and ideas in concert with each other than we tend to realize. And it's just something to keep in mind that when you come across a scholar, particularly like the 19th century German and 20th century German scholars, they were the worst. Mostly German Protestant scholars, they really hated the Greeks. They really hated Greek ideas, and they tried to find, Neoplatonism was the boogeyman behind every ancient patristic text that they were trying to extricate and purify. And it turns out that was a completely conceptual falsehood. Anyway, that's a sort of a summary. So the Nephesh is the soul, the neck and the throat, the breath of man, or more particularly individual life bound up with the body. So not even strictly soul in a Greek sense. When one dies, the Nephesh, i.e. the breath, leaves, but that doesn't mean the Hebrew asked where it went. Okay, that was not really part of their conceptual worldview. The heart, Lev, is the center of man's spiritual life, the organ of feelings, will, and intellectual activity. It's what we mean by the Greek word nous. So whenever you see the word N-O-U-S, nous, that's a Greek word. It corresponds in Hebrew to heart, and it means the same thing. And if you will find this everywhere in the Old Testament, that the heart is the center of man's spiritual life, the organ of spiritual feelings, spiritual will, and spiritual activity, right? Not rational activity, but spiritual activity. There's a difference. The difference is what we were talking about in the sermon today, what it means to see spiritually, not intellectually. You can be highly educated and highly sophisticated in terms of your rational, intellectual capacity, but if your heart is defiled, you will not see God. And that's oftentimes exactly the thing that Jesus was encountering, was that those who had all the gifts of the temple and the synagogue and the law and the prophets, this Jewish life, they were oftentimes rigidly opposed to him because their hearts were closed to his presence. But of course, many others weren't. They did see him. Yes.
You say nous as the heart of man. You mean like the center of his being, not as in like idea, the organ, right?
Right. So it doesn't mean the physical muscle that's pumping. It means the center of our being. And there's an interesting corollary that science has kind of come up with over the last couple of decades that recognize that we all have a second brain. And that second brain lies in this area. It's related to the diaphragm and the heart as well. It's a massive nerves that we all have. That's why we get butterflies in our stomach. We get really anxious and nervous. We feel it here more than we feel something up here. That's because there's all these nerves down there. And it turns out that getting this healthy is a signal aspect of the Christian life or the spiritual life. Yes, question.
I was going to ask, so if this is like the center of man's being, where they feel feelings, what would be the one for like thinking, really, like thinking, sort of logical?
Logiki. Yeah. Which interesting though, logiki refers to logos. In the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. We always want to translate logos. We're going to read that on Pascha. That is the Paschal Gospel reading. And we're going to translate it word. And we instinctively want to say, oh, word. Word means language. And it does, and logiki refers to language, the use of language to elucidate truth and that sort of thing. But it means more than that as well, of course. In the Greek sense, logos is the unifying concept of the cosmos. Logos is the key that explains how and why everything was made. And that's why it's so significant that John says, Jesus is the logos, right? Everything points to him. He is the center of all things. And that means that our rational capacity to make sense of the physical world logically must lead to the one in whom the physical world is created in the first place, which is the logos. Logiki relating to logos. A couple of other things that we'll say before we get to the fall. Man's life in paradise. We were mortal by nature, but immortal by grace. And that's really important because it means that we are contingent upon God. We can only be what we were made to be when we are in proper relationship with our Creator. And so in that sense, we have to understand that we are limited. And the great human sin, the great human temptation is to attempt to live in an unlimited way. To have life without God, which would be to cast off the boundary that defines what it means to be created. And perhaps the most stunning example of this others have said this, but in literature, is in Dostoevsky's novel Demons. Used to be translated The Possessed, but it's probably a better translation would be Demons, where there is a sort of an atheistic anarchist who's trying to find the furthest extremes of freedom, and he comes to the realization that he didn't ask for life, so he can only be free if he denies life itself. And there's this whole scene where he commits suicide by ideology. In other words, out of his own ideology, he kills himself. And it is absolutely terrifying. The way that Dostoevsky describes it is just stunning. But the only way to truly get out is to destroy ourselves. Otherwise, we simply have to accept, oh wait, I'm not. Okay, I'm limited. God is God. God is in a way that I am not, right? He is beyond. Accept that. Communion with God is therefore the very ground of our being. This is why food is such a big part of creation and paradise. All the trees and bushes and plants in paradise are there for you to simply take and eat. And all of that food is given sacramentally as an event of communion. That's what food really is for. It's not simply to give our bodies life. It's to connect to another. And ultimately that other is God. And we'll see later on how that influences our understanding of what the Eucharist really is. But food is at the center. That's one of the reasons we're fasting right now. Food is not an irrelevant spiritual life and theological life. The man, the human person, first created, had priesthood. And one of the things it means to be a priest is to take what is offered and receive. We all have a priesthood by having been created in the first place. But here's an interesting thing that's really, really important, and that is that the fathers, particularly from Irenaeus onwards, understood, Irenaeus was the one who articulated what the church had always believed, understood that Adam and Eve, as we understand them, were created and lived by grace without sin, but they were immature. They were not perfect. And this is really, really important when it comes to the fall. Because if they were perfect, why did they fall? Right? If they were perfect, then God must have wanted them to fall. But it turns out that in the Greek patristic viewpoint, and we would argue what is plainly evident in the Scriptures, is that in fact Adam and Eve were created in a state, but they were called. Their life was one of. I want to read a few things. They were created to change dynamically, to grow and move towards God in the mystery of Christ, to, by their own will, continually choose God and continually choose to renew their communion with Him. In other words, in the human person, God wasn't creating an automaton. He wasn't creating a pet or a toy. He was creating someone who was truly other. And that means they have the freedom to respond or the freedom not to respond. And this gets into biblical language in the Hebrew. To love is to choose. To hate. So think when God says, Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated in Genesis, right? Doesn't mean he couldn't stand Esau. He was just so terrible, you know? It simply means Jacob I have chosen. Esau I have rejected. In other words, to be the bearer of my covenant, the one through whom salvation would come through into the world. To love and to hate is to reject. And the human person is created with precisely that ability to love and to hate, to choose. This gets to this question of grace and nature. Nature are complementary. Man is truly only himself when he exists in God. Therefore, our natural state involves an upward openness. According to St. Maximus the Confessor, the human person is granted 4 gifts: being, eternity, goodness, and wisdom. But while the first 2 are completed gifts, being and eternity by grace, the second 2 are aspirational potentialities, goodness and wisdom. In order for us to grow and to become truly the children and members of the household of God, we've got to choose goodness. To choose the opposite of those things. That's what the serpent is going to take advantage of. We are to pursue them and ascend upwards to the likeness of God. Thus, man is created to be an open being, naturally possessing a divine spark within him. Yes, that sounds a little Gnostic, but that's where Gnosticism isn't entirely wrong. There is a divine spark, but that is dynamically oriented and to realize its completion in the other, the God who is transcendent to all. So this helps understand that Adam and Eve were immature. They were called to grow. They were called to feed in the garden, to receive the wisdom of grace. In the story of the fall, where you have the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and you have the tree of life, the Father, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the tree from which they would have eaten eventually. Prohibition on it: do not eat of this tree, otherwise you will die. It's a warning. It's not an arbitrary, law. I've created all these trees, but just for kicks, don't eat the fruit of this one. That's not what's going on there. He's saying you've got to ascend to that tree. You've got to ascend upwards to that tree. You've got to become. You've got to continually choose and exercise your freedom and your will. And the Orthodox tradition is quite radically committed to that idea that as limited as we are as created beings, to be created in the image and likeness of God with real choice. So let me point out that some of what I'm saying here is quite opposite the Western position that the first created man, the Adam and Eve, were created perfect in an unmoved or unmoving state of blessing. All right? Develops as a Latin teaching that Adam and Eve were in paradise and they were in an unmoving state. This starts to capture the language as well of Origin sees the human person in a state of unmoving contemplation, and the fall occurs, and then they become physical, and then the world, materializes and that sort of thing. All of that rejected at the Fifth Ecumenical Council. But we see this in the Latin tradition and therefore the later Roman Catholic tradition. They begin to see Adam and Eve as being already in a state of unmoved blessing. So And then afterwards, after the fall, the human person is so incapable of choosing the good without God specifically giving them grace. In that sort of abstraction of the human person, we become bound very quickly. All right, so think about this just real quickly. If you are in a state of unmoving blessing, how do you fall? What is it if you're in a state of perfection? How is it that those who were created were in a state of perfection fall? Well, okay, there's a serpent that comes along, but obviously in the farther extremes of Reformed theology, they're going to actually say that God himself, in his sovereignty, must have intended the fall, otherwise he's not really sovereign. If something happened that God didn't want to happen, then that threatens the sovereignty of God. And this is an imposition of ideology upon this matrix of communion in freedom, in love, that is the real story and the real prophetic vision of Christianity. So after the fall, though, what does it mean to be so infected by the fall as to be incapable of choosing the good without God specifically giving him grace? What is that grace called? Does anyone know? What grace does God give you so that you can begin to choose him?
Is it irresistible grace?
This grace is irresistible.
Creating grace.
It's prevenient. Yes, prevenient grace. Prevenient grace is the grace that's necessary before you can choose. These are Western categories that don't exist in Orthodoxy. That's why I mentioned it.
Well, that's not the same concept of the Immaculate Conception.
Yes, which we're going to talk about here in a second. If you're so fallen and so freedom is totally bound, then God, without God giving you special grace, then one of the mysteries of why some people choose God and why other people don't choose God is that God gives his prevenient grace to some and he withholds it from others, right? That can only be the key to understanding the mystery of human choice and freedom and will. And furthermore, that this prevenient grace is irresistible. Therefore, if God gives it to you, you cannot resist it. You must choose him. You will be a believer, even if you don't really want to be. And that's where you hear someone got a hold of me. I went in kicking and screaming, but he gave me. I couldn't resist it. I ended up in church. I was a hellraiser, but then I ended up going to church, and my life turned around. But I didn't want it. It was God who wanted me. Here's the thing. How is it different from an Orthodox point of view? Well, first of all, and I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here on the fall, but first of all, we believe that what the Latins call prevenient grace in its irresistibility is in fact a grace that's given to all of creation. We don't distinguish between God gives it to some people so that they can believe, and God doesn't give it to other people so that they will not believe, and somehow then be an example in hell for those who were randomly given the grace. That's not part of our worldview at all. But you can see how this starts to raise these questions, and we'll get to the Immaculate Conception in a moment.
So overthinking gets you.
Yeah, overthinking, but also conceptual confusion. Imposing other ideas upon the text that aren't really there. The idea that Adam and Eve were in a state of unmoving perfection has incredible implications all the way down the line to salvation. Incredible implications for the fall itself. And so that's why it's really important for us to realize, for the fathers of the Eastern Church, they did not see Adam and Eve in a state of perfection. They saw them more like children who were growing. They were to grow into their life in God.
That's amazing. Forget Joey Mitchell back to the garden.
This also means our growth never ends and is not defined by rational understanding, but by participation in God. This is our unique and quite un-Western epistemology. To truly know is to be in God. Knowledge is experiential and prophetic of the vision of God. Logically engaging revealed premises isn't rejected out of hand, it's just considered inferior knowledge. So the entire architecture of scholasticism to us is really an inferior way of approaching God than in the mystical theology of the Eastern Church, which I highly recommend. There's a book by Vladimir Lasky entitled The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. If you want to, read that whole mindset. It's everywhere, of course, but that's there. So let me just mention then a couple more things, and then we'll probably close for today and continue next week. But what this means is that freedom and grace are not opposed. Just as in an Orthodox point of view, nature and grace are not opposed. Nature, in order for us to be naturally as we are, we must be in a state of grace. Grace is the realization of our true nature. In the Western tradition, these terms will be used very differently, and nature will be understood to primarily be meaning fallen nature, and grace is necessary to overcome that fallen nature. So that's where that prevenient grace comes in, that irresistible grace. And for those who don't choose to believe in God, they weren't given it, so tough luck, you know. But for us, to be natural is actually to be as we were created in grace. And grace and nature are not in competition. Grace and freedom are not in competition. To be free is to choose the grace that God freely gives. And so an image for us to really take from this is to understand that we've been put on this earth, and this is a very important aspect of Adam and Eve's story. We have been given everything that we need for our life and for our salvation. God has not withheld any of it from anyone at any time. And one of the real keys to the patristic understanding of the fall, the garden, is that Adam and Eve had everything that they needed at that time to be faithful when the serpent came with his suggestion that they eat of the tree of knowledge. Their fall was not preordained. It was not predestined. It was not inevitable. They could have said, wait a second, we can only truly be ourselves when we are in communion with God, and you're trying to get us to act against our own nature. And when they choose to act against their own nature is when they become corrupted or sick. And corruption, as a biblical term, doesn't mean, like a corrupted... corruption doesn't mean like a criminal mind, right? A criminal intent. It means to be distorted and twisted. A file gets corrupted in your computer. What does that mean? You can't read it correctly anymore. It's all a mishmash. And that's what happens to the human person after the fall, is we have a corrupted nature, or as we'll see, predominantly a moral nature. And let me just sort of vault us into next week so that we can do this effectively. Because we could keep on going today, but I think it's already been a long day, and I don't want to give you too much at once. The primary issue in the fall, as we will see, and a distinction between the Western and Eastern tradition, which is going to help us understand our Orthodox approach to who Jesus is, why Jesus is the way that he is, and what he does for us, is to understand that the fall is really the story of death coming into the world. That Adam and Eve were in a state of innocence, but they sinned. And through that sin, which was to deny their own nature, by nature I am dependent upon God, I will try to be dependent only on me. By denying their own nature, they reject God and they fall into mortality. What they will pass on to their children is precisely that condition of mortality, that death. And this is where there's interesting questions of the baptism of infants and interesting questions on the Immaculate Conception, which we'll talk about. I know you guys won't be here next week, but it'll be on the thing. That are very, very stark differences between the Western and Eastern tradition, particularly the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic tradition. Because in the West, what comes to dominate from the time of Augustine onwards is that really parents pass on a sin nature to their children, and that sin nature is literally to be in a state of condemnation. Calvin goes on to explain this in his Institutes, that infants, when they're born, are detestable to God, is the language that he uses. That's very alien language to us as Orthodox Christians, because for us, no one chooses to be born. No one is born in a state of condemnation, but we're all born with a mortal nature. And Christ is going to save us by taking this mortal nature to himself and making it the passageway to immortality. So I'll save that as the passageway to next week. Next week we're going to be talking in detail about the fall, the distinction between the Western ideas of the fall and the Eastern understandings of the fall, and then we'll really be talking about the work of Christ and the person of Christ, how he takes what is broken in us, makes it whole in himself, joins us to himself so that we can be saved. Okay? Have a blessed day.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
You're saying, and I understand, the body is part of the soul. But what about the spirit?
Oh, good, yeah. Well, hold on, let me